Book 3. Chapter 17. In the dark before dawn, a caravan moved slowly away from Mercadia, through circling walls of stone and garbage. Gerard and his companions trailed in its wake. Here in the shadow of the mountain, the ground was dry enough to produce dust, which masked the rebels and their stolen Jovals. The corral Gerard had landed next to had turned out to belong to a city guard. He had borrowed several mounts from the stables. It seemed poetic justice. The guard was in such disarray they were unlikely to miss the Jovals until it was far too late to do anything about the theft. They should have learned from my training, Gerard told himself dryly, spitting dust from his teeth. It was not the first or last time he would spit on that long, dusty journey. Despite the inevitable grit, Weatherlight's crew members rode with a glad ease. For Gerard and Tungarth, the journey meant freedom after long incarceration. For Sisay, it was a chance to negotiate with sword instead of word. For Davis, Talacaster, Fewsteam, Chamas, and Ilcaster, the smell of clean dirt was welcome after months in the perfumed fedor of Mercadia. All were glad to be riding, and soon fighting, together. It was like old times. Only Takara rode apart. Since her mysterious arrival, she had hung back in the pack, lending aid where it was required but offering little comment. Perhaps she sensed the crew's growing distrust of her. Perhaps she knew that Gerard no longer welcomed her advice. The others left the fiery Rathai alone. By the dawn of the second day, her reticence was beginning to wear on her comrades. In the dusty morning, Gerard's curiosity at last awakened. He let his Joval fall back among the other steeds until he came even with Takara. Keeping his eyes trained on the road ahead, Gerard said, "You've been pretty quiet on this trip." Takara's mount stalked easily forward. "Yes." "Something bothering you?" Gerard pressed. "You seemed happy enough to join us." "My father is dead." Gerard's eyes grew wide. He stammered. He's dead?" "Murdered. In the infirmary as one of those Ramosan assassins." "Ramosan assassins?" Gerard echoed amazedly. "The city is rife with them. The cards are worthless. They haven't the first clue to where to find the killer." Gerard's eyes followed the rumpled ground. "I'm sorry, Takara. I shouldn't have intruded on your grief." "Oh, I don't grieve," she said bitterly. "I never grieve. I only hate. I'm going to corner the man who killed my father. I'm going to wrap my fingers around his neck and rip his throat out." She turned her gaze towards Gerard. Her eyes were as sharp as poignards. "You know where the Ramosans hide out?" Pursing his lips, Gerard said quietly, "No, I couldn't help you there." Jaw flexing grimly, Takara peered toward the front of the caravan. "Aren't you needed up there?" Gerard nodded, nudging his Joval with his heels. "Sorry to have intruded on your hatred." 2 days out, the caravan they'd been following turned off to the north. The Weatherlight Brigade continued to the west. The directions to the Ormouse, such as Gerard had managed to ascertain, were tantalizingly vague. The Cho Aram had provided their best map scrolls, but even those were only approximate. By Sisay's reckoning, a Joval journey of 5 days west, bearing along the line of the Great Scales at darkest night, would bring them in sight of the fabled place. The plains rose in a long, gentle slope and then fell away into a valley. At the far end, the road curved through a series of high paths. The earth was very black and moist, but with surprisingly little vegetation. The road they followed grew narrower and less used. Finally, they could follow it only by tracking along a widely spaced series of huge gray stones on its edge. At the mouth of a wide, swampy gorge, Gerard halted, and the others stopped behind him. "What's the matter?" Sisay wiped her forehead. The day had been hot, and the sun was only just beginning to sink into the south, amid a striated series of clouds. They were facing a long passage between two mesas. The high cliffs made the blood-red rocks drop to the foul-smelling fens at their feet. Drowned forests stood white amid marshy grasses. Clouds of insects hovered in the air. The stillness and the unpleasant odor that lingered in that air contributed to the atmosphere of rot and decay that hung over everything and bore down on the travelers. Gerard said, "We're not here alone." He looked at Tungarth. The Minotaur nodded.
"Yes, someone is watching us."
"Who?" Instinctively, the party drew their mounts closer together. Gerard loosened his sword in its sheath. Before the Minotaur could reply, a black shape surged up from behind a dead tree that bordered the road. As it raced toward them, it gave an unearthly, ululating cry. The shout was echoed a few seconds later by other creatures emerging from the swampy forest. They rose from the muck, gray-skinned manifestations of it. Once men, these withered and shambling monsters were draped in whatever clothes had survived the ravages of rot. Here and there, bones showed through sloughing flesh. The creatures shrieked as they stormed the party. Their screams rebounded from the white ghosts of downed trees. "Deepwood ghouls!" Takar shouted as her sword raked free. Tungarth's Striva slashed off the head of the foremost ghoul. Rather than collapsing, the body of the creature pushed its way blindly forward, groping in a horrid parody of human action. Its arms embraced Tungarth's Joval. The six-legged tiger creature reared, slashing its forepaws across gray flesh. Claws tore open the undead thing's belly as if ripping a sack of old leather. Out tumbled desiccated organs. Parts quivered on the ground, but still the ghoul raked forward. With a shout of disgust, Tungarth kicked the headless monster away from him. Another group of ghouls converged from the other side of the road. Swiftly, Weatherlight's crew backed their steeds into a circle. Swords menaced above the snarling and spitting heads of the Jovals. The ghouls showed no fear, leaping inward. Sisay bent from her saddle, thrusting her blade into the heart of the nearest ghoul. Steel crackled through dead flesh and snapped ribs as though they were twigs. Her sword sunk deep. A full foot of blade protruded from the monster's back. It kept coming. Its decaying fingers gripped Sisay about her waist and pulled her down into the dust. White bones with shredded flesh sank into Sisay's neck. It squeezed, strangling her. A Joval bounded up beside her and a sword flashed down. Gerard's blade slashed the arm away from the ghoul's body. From the other side, Fewsteam attacked with a heavy mace. Spikes fell, impaling the thing's skull. Powdery brain ghosted out of the air. The strike smashed the ghoul's body to the earth. Sisay pried the dead hand from her neck and retreated among the shouldering Jovals. The party was fighting perhaps 20 of the flesh-eaters. The ghouls were impervious to mortal wounds. They bore on. Regardless of the injuries they suffered, survival did not matter to them, only destruction of their foes. Despite their obvious mindlessness, the ghouls seemed to attack in concert. Two ghouls would slash at adjacent Jovals, opening a space into which a third could charge. As though they were the dumb pawns of a much larger mind, playing out the battle like a game of chess. And every good chess player guards his king.
They fight with a vengeance!
Gerard shouted above the melee. As his sword split the head of another creature, he yelled,
They fight like guardians!
He heard a shriek to his right and saw that one of the ghouls had plunged a rusting sword into the heart of Fewsteam's Joval. The great tiger sank to its knees, its head jerking back and forth as lifeblood poured out. Fewsteam was flung from his saddle, and a pair of ghouls dragged the hapless crewman toward the swamp beyond the road. His eyes rolled back in panic. With a shout, Gerard leaped from his own mount, which was hemmed in by a circle of slashing, clawing ghouls. He bolted over their heads. Even as he did so, he heard a squeal of agony from his Joval. It, too, fell victim to the bloodbath. The Venalian reached the fen. He swung his sword and cut in half one of the ghouls holding Fewsteam. Sisay ran up behind him and disposed of the other creature. They dragged Fewsteam out of the muck. On the road above, the situation was improving. The crew had destroyed a dozen attackers at the cost of 3 Jovals. The other ghouls continued to press forward without hesitation. The tide of the battle had clearly turned. Despite a dozen small cuts on his chest and arms, Tungarth scooped up a ghoul and threw it some 20 feet away to smash against a twisted tree. Takara cut the legs out from beneath another at the same moment that Ilcaster chopped its head from its shoulders. The severed head bounded along the road into the ditch, where it sank beneath the muck, its eyes rolling in their sockets. Gerard, Sisay, and Fewsteam rejoined the others to destroy the remaining beasts. In a few minutes, the crewmen were panting, wiping their weapons and binding up each other's wounds. Without visible effort, Tungarth picked up the various pieces of ghoul left on the road and tossed them into the festering swamp. Gerard looked sadly at the mangled body of his Joval. The 2 surviving Jovals were so seriously injured that their suffering called for mercy. With a nod from Gerard, Tungarth walked them to the side of the road and swiftly, efficiently, dispatched them. Sisay looked at Gerard and sighed. "Well," she said philosophically, "I suppose we could all do with a long walk to get back in shape." "Did you notice how the ghouls fought?" Gerard asked amazedly. "I got a distinct impression they were servants of some higher being." Sisay worried her lip a little. Shomano had warned me that the road to Oromos was protected by the dead comrades of Ramos, his soldiers who were burned alive when he fell flaming from the sky. Just taking the comment as a bit of folklore, but perhaps he meant these ghouls. I should have passed on the warnings. Gerard smiled appreciatively, patting her shoulder. Your reticence was understandable, but from now on, if you remember any more of Chomano's warnings, make sure you tell us. In a legendary land, myth may prove truer than truth. None of the party was seriously injured, but the claws and teeth of the foul beings had evidently been infected with the water of the swamps. Next day, Sissy and Fustine both ran high fevers. The party camped in the shadow of cliffs far removed from the fens. Gerard soaked a rag in canteen water and pressed it to Sissy's forehead. Chalmers performed a similar service for Fustine. They spent a miserable, uncomfortable day and night before the two ill travelers had recovered enough sufficiently to move on. The next day, much to their relief, they left both swamps and cliffs behind. They had reached the top of a large plateau. The land stretched before them, dotted with clumps of trees and other vegetation. On the far horizon was a ridge of mountains, their tops capped with snow. Looking back, the party could see they had come through a long series of broken defiles that led down to the eastern plains. That night, they found plenty of wood for a fire and built a cheerful blaze to guard against the brisk wind that swept over this higher land. Sissy and Fustine huddled close to the fire. Both had recovered from their infection, but neither was as hardy as before the ghoul attack. Against the darkness, the flames made fantastic leaping shapes. Tungarth picked up a long stick from the ground and stirred the fire. A shower of sparks spat and leaped up, rising into the ebony sky. To himself, the Minotaur chanted softly a Talroom battle song. Gerard looked at him with affection. "What are you smiling about?" asked Sissy, a blanket wrapped tightly about her. "I was just thinking," Gerard returned. She moved a bit closer to him on the log. "About what?" Gerard rubbed his chin, feeling the rough bristles of his beard. "I'd forgotten how much I missed this." "Miss what, sitting miles away from your home with nothing to eat but dry rations? Nothing to do but hope you'll make the next day's march without some disaster? Nothing to wear but the clothes on your back that you haven't washed for a week?" Sissy wrinkled her nose. "I hope the gods we find a stream tomorrow. You need a bath." Gerard laughed. "I know. You're pretty ripe yourself. No, that's not what I meant." "What then?" He waved a hand around him. "All this. Companionship. Searching for something, but not knowing whether you'll find it." He shook his head. "Nothing. Never mind." Sissy put a hand on his arm. He could feel the tough calluses on her palm. "I know what you mean. Believe me, I do. Something special about the search itself, even if you don't find what you're looking for. I think sometimes that's what I was really looking for, rather than for the legacy. I was looking for the look in itself. Is that stupid?" "No. No, it's not." Gerard turned and looked Sissy full in the face. Since he'd found her in Volrath's dream halls, this was the first time he'd looked closely at her. Fine lines surrounded her eyes, a tiny streak of gray had appeared in her hair. A delicate scar, almost a decoration, it was so fine, ran from the edge of her mouth back along the line of her jaw to her ear. Her skin was weather-roughened, not the fine blush that mantled Hannah's face, yet it had a kind of unearthly beauty that was all Sissy's own. Her eyes were brown, set deep in her face, filled with pain, with joy, with a kind of wild hope. "Do you know something?" Gerard asked. "Wrath made you stronger, made you wiser, more beautiful." "It's the power of hate," interrupted Takara, sitting nearby, tossing pebbles suddenly in the fire. "Hate makes you stronger, wiser, more beautiful." Without looking at the Wrath Eye, Gerard shook his head. "No. There you're wrong. Hate eats you up from the inside. Makes you weak and stupid and ugly. It's hope that makes you strong. There are two ways to survive wrath. Hate and hope. Only hope makes heroes." The next 2 days, the road wound among trees at increasing girth and height, with branches that began 50 or 60 feet up the trunk. They were kind of completely unfamiliar to anyone in the party. In some places, the path was completely overgrown. It took all of Tongarth's and Sisse's tracking skills to keep them going in the right direction. From the lower branches of the trees, moss draped like tattered clothing, casting mysterious shadows across the path. Wherever upper branches let sun penetrate to the forest floor, lizards scuttled across the roadway or sunned themselves on rocks. At night, the party lit fires that drove back the shadows but attracted thousands of huge moths. During the still watches of the night, the rumble of vast hooves came from the forest, and huge pairs of eyes gleamed distantly with reflected firelight. It was easy enough for watchmen to stay awake, but no beast ever came close enough to be identified. On the second day in the forest, they came upon the ruin of a large stone tower among the trees. Its walls were limbed with moss and ivy, and the roof had fallen in. When new, the tower must have been impressive, but now was merely a sad reminder of a long ago glory. The crew found themselves speaking in hushed tones as they examined the ruins. It was Ilcaster who drew Gerard's attention to the glyph carved in the stone arc. The Benalian examined it carefully. Yes, no doubt about it. It's another Thran glyph. Whoever built this place knew something about the Thran. Gerard looked about the tall trees, silent witness to the unknown pass. I think, he said finally, we can safely say we've entered Oramos. The following day saw the number and size of the ruins increase. The Thran glyphs engraved on the fallen edifices were now so common that they ceased to provoke comment. The buildings were closer together, bigger and more impressive, but all were in a state of decay and ruin. Gerard saw Sissay looking about her with a slightly puzzled expression. What's the matter? He asked. She pointed to a series of walls that extended along one side of the path for a quarter mile before ceasing abruptly. These ruins, there's some odd about them. Gerard glanced around. I don't see it. That's right, chimed in Telecaster from behind them. The large blond sailor, bare to the waist, shifted his pack on massive shoulders. I mean, Captain, if you were standing out here alone for years, you'd be falling to pieces too. Sissy chuckled. I dare say you're right, but that's not what I mean. They're not just falling to pieces. They've been destroyed. What do you mean? Asked Gerard. I mean something happened to the city. Like Ramos falling on it from the sky? Or perhaps a figurative Ramos. The myth might mask a historical truth. Look. Sissay grabbed Gerard's arm and led him toward the wall. She touched the stone, which crumbled beneath her fingers. She rubbed her fingertips, and the stuff turned to white powder. I've seen something like this before on Dominaria. She pushed a few stones. They fell with a thump to the forest floor. This wall's been blasted by sudden heat. Gerard, Sissay, Tongarth, come look at this. The three turned, making their way to where Ilcaster and Davos stood near a large mound. Both were holding their hands before their faces, warding off the stench that rose from the mound. Oof. What have you two found? Gerard's eyes watered. Tongarth spat once.
Tomalongo!
Spore! Sissay translated for Gerard's benefit. Drop-ins from something? Whatever it is, it's huge. Gerard walked around the pile of excrement carefully to keep his distance. Everybody, keep your eyes open and your noses covered. Travelers moved on down the road into dim green recesses. Another hour of silent tramping brought them to a small clearing. There they halted for a moment to rest. Sissay sank to the ground, head between her hands, knees drawn up. Although she had largely recovered from the fever a few days previously, neither she nor Fustine were quite as healthy as the others. Tongarth moved restlessly about the glade while Gerard took a long pull from his water skin. In the forest they had found several streams, all of which seemed excellent sources of drinking water. Sir, Davos ran up. The dark-haired Acacian was about as excited as Gerard had ever seen him. He opened his clenched fists. Look, sir! Gerard gasped. Power stone. Tiny, no more than a mere speck compared to the crystal that powered Weatherlight, but it was nonetheless a glowing power stone, shining with its own source of internal fire. Excellent! He clapped Davos on the shoulder. Where was it? Just lying on the ground. Davos, almost too excited to speak, stuttered. I saw a glow from off to the side, and there it was, just lying on the ground like somebody dropped it. In an instant, the group was down on its knees in the spot Davos had indicated, clawing through the undergrowth. After a frantic, silent 10 minutes of searching, Gerard gave up with a sigh. All right, this is only one, but the important thing is we know we're on the right track. He lifted his pack to his shoulders. Let's go. The companions proceeded in single file, Gerard leading the way and Tongarth, his sword drawn, bringing up the rear. Before them, the path grew more obscure, the trees denser. To either side, they heard a series of deep rumbles, with an occasional hiss that sounded like the heavy breathing of some mighty creature. Without a word, the party halted, and swords were drawn from scabbards. Gerard placed a finger on his lips, and they stole cautiously forward. Suddenly, the trees parted. A great vista opened. They found themselves blinking in the unexpected sunlight. Before them, the land dipped in a wide bowl carved from the living rock, a great arena overrun by weed, creeper. In the center, perhaps 1,000 feet from where the party stood, was a great circle of raised sand. low but baked and gleaming in the bright sunlight. Standing stones, carved with Thran glyphs, ringed the sandy circle. In the center of the circle was a large flat stone table resembling an altar. The altar stone in turn held 5 large crystals, glinting in the sunlight. Oramos, Gerard said in awe. Sisay looked at him, nodded. Yes, those must be the power stones, the bones of Ramos. Takara said, It's not likely those stones would remain undisturbed all these years unless they were pretty well guarded magic, or worse. The Benalian cast a quick glance all around. All right, there's no point in all of us going down there. Wherever a place likely to be rigged with traps in some kind, this is it. Sisay and Tongarth, you're with me. The rest of you stay here, keep a sharp eye out. His instructions were interrupted by a terrified scream behind him. Gerard turned. Ilcaster's dark, handsome face contorted with pain. He was caught in the grip of 2 vines that had snaked across the path, entwining his feet. The lad fell to the ground, drew his knife, and hacked at the green tendrils. Gerard darted in and chopped down with a sword. It clanged away. The vines were hard as steel. Ilcaster gave a yell of horror. There was a spurt of blood from severed arteries as the clinging vines cut through flesh and bones in his ankle. Another vine, writhing as if it were a snake, shot across the path and gripped him around the throat, cutting off his cry. A moment later, his head rolled free beside Gerard's feet. Sisay and the others curved in a tight circle, facing outward. Gerard joined them. From the woods, more vines groped inward. The crew bashed them back with ringing blades. A young sapling lashed down atop the crew like a scourge. Tongarth reached up, grasped the bowl, and viciously snapped off the top. The rest of the tree sprang back, seemed to give a shriek of pain. Thick green sap surged from the wound. A vine yanked Sisay's feet from under her. Gerard jerked her upright and battered the tendril until it let it go. The tree trunk smashed to the ground beside Talacaster, missing him by a hair's breadth. Below the feet of the crewmen, the ground boiled and turned to mud, imprisoning his feet. He screamed and sank farther into the morass. Gerard pulled at his arms in a vain attempt to pry him loose. Gerard's fingers dug into the sailor's flesh. Talacaster's eyes bulged with fear. The sailor slipped another few inches, pulling Gerard with him. In a moment, he too would be trapped by the mud. Gerard felt the man's hand slip away. Benalian had a last brief glance at Talacaster's face, crazed face, sinking below the mud. Then he was gone. A blast of wind trembled the treetops and rose to a screaming gale. The trees shook. Leaves, pine needles, and fir cones beat on their heads. The very ground bucked and swayed beneath their staggering feet. "We can't last here!" Gerard shouted. "Retreat!" They did, moving cautiously away from the great bowl of Ormos. "Look!" Sisay yelled, stopping short. The crew were suddenly surrounded by fantastical figures. Roughly human in shape, they had green hair and pale green skin. Long, slender fingers waved as if branches. They were clad in leaves, twigs, and vines, knitted together in sheaths that barely covered their lean bodies. Their hands were raised, crossed together, and linked in a curious pattern. As if from a great distance, Gerard heard a sound that could only be described as singing. "More defenders," Sisay said breathlessly as Gerard staggered up beside her. "Dryads,"